James Bradberry of the New York Giants on the outs, but another team is going to get a very good player in James Bradberry on the cheap.
The New York Giants are starting to scare me. Yeah, I know, very surprising to hear this from me. But when you take a minute to take a look at what they are doing and what their future is going to look like, you'd understand why, as a Dallas Cowboys fan, I'm very scared of the New York Giants in the NFC East. Maybe not this year, at least on paper, maybe not this year, but the one thing that the New York Giants had in the past that made them an absolute laughingstock in the entire league is the fact that they had Dave Gettleman making the most boneheaded decisions in that front office. And with Dave Gettleman there, as a Dallas Cowboys fan, even though we make our own boneheaded decisions, I felt fairly safe against the New York Giants. But unfortunately for us, it seems like this front office actually has a plan, and their plan is absolutely brilliant. So before we get to the content, in 6 days we're going to be announcing a giveaway winner for $500 on this channel. All you have to do to enter is subscribe and turn on our notifications. And on top of that, if you want to see me live stream talking about football with you guys personally, follow me on twitch.tv/TF Microphone. Now that we get all that out of the way, break! Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? The New York Giants have been in headlines for all the wrong reasons for the most part. I mean, if you go back a couple of months, you'd hear the fact that Saquon Barkley was involved in trade rumors. More recently, you heard this rumor that Kadarius Toney might be on the trade block. And today, they released a former Pro Bowl cornerback, James Bradberry, and as a result, they're gonna have to take on almost $12 million in dead money. So you might be wondering, Mike, why on earth are you intimidated? Well, first things first, if you look at the plan that the New York Giants are cultivating down in New York, it seems like this team has a very clear and defined direction. This past offseason, there was a remarkable opportunity for the New York Giants to go after Brian Flores and Deshaun Watson. As a matter of fact, there were several rumors suggesting that Deshaun Watson wanted to play in New York and would like his head coach to be Brian Flores. But in the New York Giants perspective, that seemed like fool's gold to them. And at the time, a bunch of New York Giants fans scoffed at this. I mean, how could you look at Deshaun Watson and say, yeah, we don't want this guy. We'd rather go ahead and move forward with Daniel Jones, who hasn't shown us much promise at all whatsoever, apart from being an extremely average quarterback at best, despite him being surrounded by a decent amount of talent. I mean, Daniel Jones last year had Kadarius Toney, who didn't play a full season, but when he did, he had moments where he was very promising. Kenny Golladay, who signed the biggest wide receiver contract out of any free agent last year, in addition to previous signings like Evan Ingram. He had Saquon Barkley, who had trouble staying healthy. The one thing that was holding back Daniel Jones was Joe Judge. And ultimately, we saw that throughout the regular season. I mean, Daniel Jones had a fairly pedestrian year once again. His completion percentage improved marginally. He threw 10 touchdowns to 7 interceptions for just over 2,400 yards. But there is something to be said about a front office that looks at a quarterback and says,
this man has been screwed throughout his entire career.
As a matter of fact, ownership of the New York Giants came out and said that this man, Daniel Jones, didn't have a chance at all whatsoever. So we're gonna give him another chance this year. You might be thinking that the New York Giants have this tremendous faith in Daniel Jones, and as a result, they want to build around him for the future. They truly believe in Danny Dimes. It's not that simple. You see, the New York Giants have a plan on multiple levels, where if plan A fails, there's a clear-cut plan B where they're going to be set up really well for. And it's not the fact that they looked at Daniel Jones and said, hey, we love Daniel Jones. I understand that people aren't necessarily the biggest fan of Brian Daboll. It really depends on whether you think that he was instrumental to Josh Allen's development or Josh Allen just developed by himself. But assuming that he was instrumental to Josh Allen's development, which is what I personally believe, then the first step of this strategy is very simple. Try to see what Daniel Jones could do under one season with Brian Daboll. Now, meanwhile, as this is going on, the New York Giants are doing something that I haven't seen them do in quite some time. time, and that's making reasonable draft choices. I mean, the most famous instance is the 2018 NFL draft, where they desperately needed offensive line help, but they decided to use the number 2 overall pick on Saquon Barkley instead of drafting Quentin Nelson. And in the second round, they drafted Will Hernandez, who has plenty of untapped potential, but is no longer on the team. And typically what New York Giants fans wish would have happened is them selecting Quentin Nelson with their number 2 overall pick, although I will admit that would have been very, very high up for an offensive guard, albeit a offensive guard that could anchor your offensive line for at minimum the next decade. And you could have selected Nick Chubb in the second round. And then you look at the decision they made last year, for example. They clearly wanted to select Devontae Smith in the 2021 NFL draft. It was very clear that they needed a wide receiver. However, 2 of their NFC East rivals decided to collude with one another to effectively screw the New York Giants out of selecting Devontae Smith. The Philadelphia Eagles leapfrogged in front of the Giants, drafted Devontae Smith, and the Giants had to trade back to the 20th pick where they selected Kadarius Toney. Now, the year before, they didn't necessarily have the worst pick with Andrew Thomas, but if you look at the 2019 NFL draft, it's a prime example of more incompetence from Dave Gettleman, drafting Daniel Jones with the 6th overall pick in a relatively weak quarterback class, might I add. Then they drafted Dexter Lawrence, who isn't necessarily a superstar, but is an average defensive tackle. And then, of course, the infamous DeAndre Baker, their final first-round pick in the 2019 NFL draft, who is most likely never going to play football ever again. You compare that with the current regime. You look at this last NFL draft, and even if these players don't end up succeeding, New York Giants fans could look at the picks and say, these made sense, right? The very first pick that they selected was Kayvon Thibodeau with their 5th overall selection. They did this in a situation where Ikem Ekwonu or Evan Neal were available on the board. With their second round pick, they decided to take a chance on a wide receiver and what is supposed to be a loaded wide receiver draft, drafting Wan'Dale Robinson out of Kentucky. And I don't want to go into their later round picks, but at least when you look at their first 3 picks in this past NFL draft, you could say it makes sense, just like their strategy that makes sense. Well, what about Daniel Jones? It's very simple. Brian Dable's gonna get his hands on Daniel Jones. If Daniel Jones ends up succeeding or taking a step forward this season, then you can expect the New York Giants to sign him to a longer contract. But in the event that Daniel Jones doesn't take that next step, well, the New York Giants didn't want to pursue their quarterback of the future in this year's NFL draft, where one of the top QB prospects ended up falling all the way to the 3rd round. They wanted to give Daniel Jones one more season. If he's horrible, then you probably will end up with a top 5 or top 10 draft pick in a draft class that is supposed to boast the likes of Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, and this is just very, very early on. We don't know what other player is going to come out of nowhere and end up adding to this already fairly strong 2023 NFL draft quarterback class. And I understand Deshaun Watson is fairly attractive, don't get me wrong, but hitting on a quarterback in the NFL draft or putting a quarterback in a situation where you could truly develop his talent with a head coach who already has a proven track record in developing talent is significantly more valuable than pursuing a player like Deshaun Watson and paying him $240 million guaranteed. Now, don't get me wrong, it's significantly harder to hit on a QB in the NFL draft, but if you are to hit on said QB in the NFL draft and you already cultivated a good defense around him and a good offensive line around him, and you have plenty of cap space to work with, which by the time all of this dead money comes off of the books from releasing James Bradbury, from releasing Kyle Rudolph, from releasing Devontae Booker and Caden Smith, from letting Nate Soldier walk, then by the time it's time to potentially build around said rookie QB in 2 years from now, the New York Giants are going to have potentially a franchise cornerstone quarterback to build around with a ton of cap space by the time the dead money comes off the books. And the prime example of this is a neighboring team that they have in their state. No, not the New York Jets, but the Buffalo Bills. A lot of people seem to forget this, but when Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott first showed up to the Buffalo Bills, the Bills essentially cleaned house for the Tyrod Taylor era. Tyrod Taylor was there for one more season and actually performed remarkably. He had one of his best seasons throughout his entire career and did a fantastic job as a game manager. As a matter of fact, the Buffalo Bills were even able to make it to the wild card round, and had it not been for a concussion to Tyrod Taylor, there would have been a decent chance that the Buffalo Bills could have potentially beat the Jacksonville Jaguars, as they only lost 10-3. Regardless, the Buffalo Buffalo Bills decided to trade Tyrod Taylor to the Cleveland Browns that offseason and selected the biggest developmental prospect in the entire NFL draft, Josh Allen. Even then, they were still considered to be a huge laughingstock with a pretty nice defense. And Josh Allen's first season under center was by no means a cakewalk. Everyone called him a running back that was playing the quarterback position. His mechanics were still messed up. There was a long ways for Josh Allen to go to become the Josh Allen we all know and love today. You're talking about a man that literally threw for 2,000 passing yards, 10 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions through his first season. But in 2019, he started taking the next step. And next thing you know, in 2020, he's already passing for over 4,500 yards in the entire NFL, while still on a rookie scale contract. The Buffalo Bills, who cleaned house prior to Josh Allen's arrival, now had money to invest in their team. They were able to trade for a player like Stephon Diggs and pay him the contract that he wanted. So what I'm saying is, it's not necessarily that the New York Giants are a super team after releasing James Bradberry, but unlike most teams in the NFL, it seems like this team has a clear-cut direction. There is a plan A and a plan B, and that's more than you can ask for if you're any team in the NFL. Whether you're contending or you're not contending, so long as there's a clear-cut direction for the franchise, then everything's gonna be good. Let me know in the comment section down below what you guys think about this take. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.